Well, good morning, everybody. Again, good morning to those folks that are in the room and to everybody who is participating on the webcast. Welcome to the 6th session in the Children's Mental Health Learning Series. As many of you may be aware of, the development of the series and the information that has been provided really was in a direct response to requests from Human Services staff. Our staff told us that they wanted information on a variety of topics that would help them to better support children and families that they have the privilege of working with every single day. The information, of course, can also be provided and be of benefit to parents and caregivers. Education and healthcare professionals certainly would find these sessions, I think, very helpful in their roles in supporting children and families. I'm told that to date there's been a number of sessions that have occurred with information on such topics as developing the brain, ADHD, and very importantly, self-care for frontline workers and caregivers. We know when parents practice self-care, they are better able to provide a healthy home environment. And also of great importance are caring and supportive school environments and communities that provide a safe and secure backdrop for personal development. These kinds of communities promote a sense of belonging and they encourage individuals to make meaningful contributions to society. As you heard, I have the honor and privilege to be leading work around the issues of prevention of family violence, bullying, sexual violence, on behalf of government and many of our community partners. It really is a devastating area of impact, and we've seen some of those circumstances in public and in profile when there are circumstances in which children and families are very negatively impacted by these social issues. The term that we will be using in terms of defining bullying for the province in our work going forward, it will be defined as a deliberate, hostile, and repeated activity intended to harm or threaten another person or group. It often involves the imbalance of social or physical power, or both. Our Ministry of Human Services and the Ministry of Education will be advancing a new cross-ministry strategy that will focus very much on healthy relationships and the prevention of bullying. And I see that Dr. Hoglund's opportunity to speak with you this morning is going to focus very much on the issue of healthy relationships. We were talking earlier at our table, and the issue of bullying and some of our other areas of violence prevention is all about relationships, and so we really do need to target some of those areas. So to further help us promote a healthy environment, healthy relationships, and specifically address the issue of bullying, Dr. Wendy Hoglund is here with us today, so I'm very honored to be able to introduce her to you and this very important topic. So Dr. Hoglund is an assistant professor of developmental science in the Department of Psychology at the University of Alberta. She conducts basic and applied developmental research on children's peer relationships and social, emotional, and academic adjustment. Her research examines these developmental phenomena among low-income, ethnically diverse children in the context of the classroom and school settings. Her applied research also investigates how school-based prevention programming can promote children's healthy peer relationships. Dr. Hoglund has led the development and pilot evaluation of the PEERS program, a social, emotional, and academic learning program designed to promote young children's healthy peer relationships, mental health, and academic skills, and thereby aims to prevent peer bullying and victimization. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hoglund, and I look forward to listening to your presentation this morning, Doctor.
Well, thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thank you for attending here both in person and for those of you that are online. I was very delighted that ACCFCR invited me to come here and talk about some of the stuff that I'm deeply invested in and thinking about how we can better support children's peer relationships. I came into this work really as a graduate student when I was at the University of Victoria. This was in 1998, and right after I started as a graduate student, there were the Columbine murders. And then in Victoria in 1997, just before I had started my graduate work, Rena Verk was killed by the hand of her peers. And this really started this momentum into thinking about how can we better support children's peer relationships. And so this has really been sort of the impetus for the work that I've been interested in. and for what I want to talk to you about today. So first of all, I just want to, my talk is in 5 sections. And so first of all, I want to talk about sort of defining and understanding peer aggression and victimization. I tend to call it peer aggression rather than bullying for most of the time that I will be talking, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Then I want to talk a little bit about developmental trends. We'll talk about risk and protective factors, and then I want to focus in more on some prevention strategies, both sort of bullying prevention strategies and really thinking about moving towards more of these social emotional learning programs. It's really a way to support healthy relationships and not focus so much on the problems, but really thinking about the strengths and capacities of children. And then I'll follow up with a few recommendations. So for the first section of the talk, we'll talk about understanding peer aggression and victimization. So there's 3 definitional terms that Susan indicated that when we're thinking about peer bullying or peer aggression, and typically there really is this intent to harm. And so these are really seen as malicious forms of aggression that are directed against another peer. There's a repetition over time, and not to say that one instance of bullying or aggression can't be very harmful for a child. It's really when we want to think about these as sort of repeated over time, and these are the children that we're most concerned about, who are chronically engaging in aggression or peer bullying, and those children who are chronically experiencing that. And then the last part is this power differential, and this is typically what separates what we might consider bullying from what we might consider aggression, is that there's this inherent power differential, whether it's a physical power difference or if it's a social power difference. But most of the research that I will review, and most of the research that is sort of under the guise of peer bullying, doesn't necessarily include this power differential in the assessment. So we're not always clear whether it's peer bullying or peer aggression, and we see very similar risk factors for and risk protective factors for, and we see very similar outcomes. So I tend to focus on calling this more sort of aggression. And I've heard adolescents tell us, stop talking to us about bullying. Bullying is just used too much sometimes. We want to talk about aggression. This is really this interpersonal aggression. It's really this harm against other people. So thinking about sort of the forms of peer aggression and victimization, there's really been sort of 4 key forms that have been identified. One, what we're all familiar with, is this physical aggression, physical victimization, and these are typically what come to the attention of adults. So this is hitting, pushing, shoving. Then there's also these more verbal forms. So these are threats to harm, name-calling, shouting. And sometimes when we've been assessing either bullying or peer aggression, it's generally more these verbal and physical forms that we've been thinking about. And we know, of course, starting really sort of in the early 2000s, late 1990s, is that relational and social aggression are just as important. And these are really about when children are using sort of their relationships to harm each other. So they might be spreading rumors or might be manipulating friendships. We hear this for young children as well, using these sort of things. You can't come to my birthday party. I don't want to be your friend anymore. And so young children are starting to use some of these forms of these relational and social aggression. Thinking about more cyber forms that have really become more prevalent in really the last decade, and the difference with the cyber aggression is that these things are on a much wider scale, and it's not that you can hit the delete button after a text message has been sent or something's been posted on the media. So they have a potential for reaching a whole host of more other children or other adolescents relative to these more traditional forms that are typically face-to-face. When we think about physical and verbal forms, these tend to be these more direct and overt forms. So you know who your aggressor is, and you typically know who the target is. With relational and social and cyber, you don't necessarily know who the aggressor is. So these can be seen as more indirect, or they can be seen as more covert in some ways. So we can think about even social aggression, so someone rolling their eyes at you, turning their back as a child enters a peer group. These are forms that children can use to sort of alienate another child. Thinking about the functions of these forms of peer aggression, what I do want to say is that while these are the typical forms of peer aggression, we also know that there's other forms. So there's sexual harassment that are targeted at sexual minority adolescents. There's also forms of ethnic victimization and ethnic aggression, so targeting someone because of their race or their ethnicity. But these are typically enacted through one of these types of forms. So there's more types of aggression and victimization, but they're typically enacted through relational or physical or verbal means. Thinking about the functions of aggression, quite a while ago, Ken Dodge started writing about these two sort of functions of aggression. One might be more proactive. So adolescents are really thinking about, and children, as these sort of intentional, goal-directed, a way to get something that they want or a way to target another child or adolescent to make them not look so good. And this is typically what we consider to be more this sort of bullying. So it's thought out. There's also this other form more of this reactive aggression. And this tends to be more in response to some perceived threat. And it might be sort of a defense or it might be an impulsive behavior. And the research suggests that these are children that would be classified along more this sort of bully-victim typology. So these children might be seen as aggressive, but they're typically reacting to threats that they're receiving from peers. So they might be targeted by peers themselves. And so this is this other group that we really want to be paying attention to. And thinking about the frequency of peer aggression, so we heard there's about 30% of kids that are chronically victimized, and this range really goes from about 10 to 30%, depending on samples. And this means that these are kids that are chronically victimized or that are chronically aggressing against other children over time. And these are the sample of children that we really want to pay attention to. We know that bullying most frequently occurs within the school context. But there's about a third of episodes that children and youth tell us about that are happening sort of off the school context. So this might be on the way to school, and it might be sort of in a community, it might be during a recreation activity. So there are these incidents that are still happening sort of off the school grounds. But we typically think of these as really sort of under the domains of the school environment and the school setting. And within the school setting, we know that children and youth typically tell us that these happen most often on the playground. So while they're happening in the classroom, they're happening more often on the playground. Within the school setting, they're also happening in the hallways, they're happening in the washrooms, really episodes or places where adults aren't necessarily present and where there tends to be a lot of children. But given that there's about 10 to 20% of adolescents and children who are chronically harmed by their peers or chronically aggressing against their peers, we know that there's also a whole host of children and adolescents who aren't chronically involved in these episodes. And so this could be about 70 to 80% of children and youth who are on the sidelines. And these are typically the bystanders. So they might not be directly experiencing that aggression or that victimization, or they might be not necessarily directly enacting it. But yet they're on the sidelines. And this is the group of youth that we really want to focus on. How can we bring the bystanders around to think about how can we support those children that are the targets of the aggression, and how can we get the youth who are engaging that aggression to stop? Of this larger group, there's only about 15% of children who would actually sort of intervene to support the target. It's a very small group of children. And these children tend to be younger than adolescents, so they tend to be younger children who are willing to intervene, and they also tend to be girls more likely. So we want to think about what are the skills that we can get children to use so that they can help support each other. And also helping other youths recognize when they're just standing by, not doing anything, they are in many ways supporting the aggressor because they're standing there watching it and condoning it. Research on cyber aggression and cyber victimization is much more recent, and the studies on the prevalence rates really suggest that these are about at the same rates. So we see about 20 to 40% of children, mostly adolescents, reporting that they've been the target of cyber aggression, and we see about this range of 5 to 35% of adolescents saying that they've actually enacted this cyber aggression. and that youth who report both being a victim and being an aggressor of cyber bullying, that is about 3 to 14%. And these are really based on statistics across Canada and across other countries. So we want to think about really what's happening for these youth. So with the sort of frequency rates in mind, I want to turn to developmental trends and thinking about what is sort of the developmental progression of peer aggression and peer victimization. So we know from a lot of research that these physical forms of aggression, victimization, they tend to peak in middle childhood. So young children are more likely to be experiencing the forms of victimization, and there's more children. So kids are sort of less, they're less selective in who they're targeting with these forms of physical aggression. And we know that these tend to start decreasing after sort of middle childhood because children become much more skilled at using their words. They sort of recognize the social, that it's not socially appropriate to be hitting and pushing someone else. And they likely come to the attention more of the adults. So there's really these ways that they can help to stop that aggression. And research also suggests that while physical aggression victimization is decreasing, we also start to see this increase in rates of more relational and social forms of aggression, and that these tend to become much more frequent by late childhood. And adolescents report that really by that transition into middle school, that these are sometimes the peaks of rates of relational or social aggression. So there's really something about that, those sort of middle school years. But nonetheless, research suggests that young children, as I mentioned earlier, are using some of these relational forms as early as preschool. So it might be that they're sort of learning the acceptability of some of these relational and social forms of aggression very much in early childhood. And we see that, not surprisingly, that cyber forms tend to be relatively uncommon in middle childhood because children don't have access necessarily to a cell phone or they don't have a computer. And so it's really not until sort of this early adolescent period that we see a peak in forms of cyber aggression and cyber victimization. And this is very likely because as children or early adolescents are just first becoming familiar with these sort of forms of technology and able to use, they're not sort of as able to understand the sort of detrimental harm that they can be causing by spreading a text message or posting a message on their Facebook. And as I mentioned earlier, these episodes, while they might be decreasing over time in terms of frequency, so not as many children are experiencing forms of victimization or enacting aggression, we really see that by the end of childhood and into adolescence, these become more selected at particular children. So we see that the sort of rates of chronic problems become more select at particular children. And what I want to point out is that these are really these average forms, our average sort of trends in victimization and aggression. And what they really suggest is that there's really a lot of heterogeneity in this. So when I suggested that there's about 10 to 30% of children who are chronically victimized, we have this other 70% of kids, and we know that some of them might be experiencing some levels of victimization and aggression. So this is where the research has really been turning, is to thinking about what's sort of the heterogeneity in experiences of victimization and enactment of aggression. So this is a study from a Quebec longitudinal sample thinking about rates of peer victimization across the preschool years. So this is really from about age 3.5 up to about age 6.5. And these were items that were reported by mothers. So mothers said their child was made fun of by other children, hit or pushed by other children, or called names. So really a collection of sort of verbal, social, and physical aggression. And we see that for most of the children, there's about 70% of the children that were very rarely did they experience peer victimization. But there was about this population of about 25% of the children that were experiencing sort of moderate levels of victimization across this 3-year period. And then there was this group of about 5% of children that were experiencing sort of these chronic levels over time. And what's sort of differentiating these groups of children, so these are really children who are sort of clustering together, is that children in this sort of high chronic group, parents also reported that they were engaging in more harsh reactive parenting and that their children are also more physically aggressive. So there was something about that relationship with their parent and also their relationship with peers that was potentially putting them on this higher trajectory of victimization relative to the children who were experiencing virtually no victimization. As a follow-up, Bonnie Leadbeater and I, several years ago, were assessing rates of peer victimization among young children. We followed a sample of children from the beginning of first grade to the end of third grade, and we were interested in what children were telling us about their rates of victimization. So children reported on their experiences of physical victimization and also their experiences of relational victimization. And we see very similar to the Barker study, but ours follows up starting at grade 1 up to grade 3, is that we had a large sample, about 70% of children reported very low levels of experiencing victimization. But there was about 20% of children that were sort of experiencing these moderate to high increasing levels over that period. So it suggests that there's really beginning to be the sort of risk potential for these young children. And we see that the children that were in these higher trajectories, these sort of increasing trajectories, they were also more likely to be rated by their teachers as having high levels of internalizing symptoms that I will come back to. So they showed high levels of anxiety and also high levels of depressive symptoms. Now, thinking about trajectories of peer aggression and sort of the heterogeneity in this sample as well, Deb Pepler and Wendy Craig followed the sample of adolescents who were about age 10 to 14, and they followed them over the course of 7 years. And this assessment was really focused on bullying. So adolescents were provided a definition of what bullying was, and it wasn't differentiating out physical or relational forms of bullying, but adolescents were reporting on how often they engaged in these bullying behaviors. And here what we see is that there was about 10% of this large sample of youth across the 7 years who reported that they were chronically aggressing or bullying their peers. And there was about 70% of children that showed these sort of low stable or moderate stable levels. So just to show you a figure of this sort of high elevating group is the one on the top that across the age 10 to 17, which is on the x-axis, that they were sort of increasing over time in their rates of bullying relative to the other groups. We have the one group with the cross who was sort of desisting over time. So at age 10 they were engaging in these bullying behaviors, but by the time they were reaching sort of late adolescence, they were engaging in very few of these aggressive behaviors. And so adolescents who were in these higher trajectories, and particularly the adolescents that were in this sort of high chronic trajectory, they were rated higher on these sort of measures of moral disengagement. So they were more likely to report that it's perfectly okay to hit someone if they hit you first. It's, you know, it's just teasing. I'm not really doing anything. So they're sort of disengaging from the morality of how you be kind to others and be nice to others. They were also somewhat lacking guilt, so they didn't feel guilty about if they were aggressing against another child. And these youth on this high chronic trajectory were also rated as being higher on measures of peer physical aggression and peer relational aggression, unsurprisingly. So we often see this sort of co-occurring association. The other thing that these adolescents were somewhat missing is really that they had these sort of conflictual relationships with their parents. So they reported very low levels of trust and caring within their relationship with their parents. They also reported the same sort of types of relationship with their peers, so they didn't have these trusting relationships with their peers. But on the other hand, they were more susceptible to peer pressure. So they were more likely to go along with peer suggestions, and they were also more likely to hang out with adolescents who were also reporting high levels of peer bullying. And so this just really gives us sort of this description of what might be some of these risk factors, both at an individual level, at a peer level, and at a family level. So now I want to turn to thinking about what some of the risk and protective factors are for peer aggression and victimization. Most of the literature in looking at peer victimization and aggression has really focused on children's symptoms of internalizing problems. So these are symptoms of anxiety, depression, not necessarily clinical levels, but really thinking about anxiety and depression on this continuum. And research is also focused on these more externalizing behaviors. So these are sometimes include indicators of bullying, so threatens others, teases others, but they're also a little bit broader that it might not necessarily just be interpersonal aggression that's being assessed. So it could be more sort of defiant behaviors like talking back to a teacher, aggressing against an animal, for instance, or hitting a wall. So it's not necessarily directed at a person. And not surprisingly, we see that both externalizing problems and internalizing problems tend to co-occur with both peer aggression and peer victimization. Some research suggests that peer victimization is more strongly related to internalizing problems than externalizing problems, and particularly more relational forms of victimization might be more related to internalizing problems than physical forms of victimization. Peer aggression, on the other hand, is more strongly related to externalizing problems. When we often think about sort of these peer relationships as contributing to later internalizing or later externalizing problems, we also see that the reverse is true, that these can become risk factors for being aggressive or being victimized. And so when we think about externalizing problems, children who sort of display these sort of disruptive, inattentive behaviors, they don't play well in a peer group necessarily, these children are at risk for being victimized because children they're sort of monitoring the behaviors that they're doing, and these behaviors might be sort of irritating, and they've been proposed to be sort of provoking of their peers. And peers are more likely to justify if that child's sort of aggressive, disruptive, it's okay if I bully them or aggress them. It's a way of sort of disengaging from that youth as though they sort of deserved it. And we see for internalizing problems that these sometimes, children who display very highly anxious or depressive sadness behaviors, that these might be seen as sort of easy targets. So children, adolescents tell us, well, they won't fight back, they don't do anything. So they're seen as that it's sort of okay to aggress against them. And where research has been looking at is really thinking about these cascading associations. So these might be things that are sort of co-occurring over time and might be influencing each other. So one of these studies that we did here with a sample of children in Edmonton here, this was a sample of children in kindergarten to grade 3, and they were telling us about their symptoms of internalizing problems, so feelings of sadness and anxiety. They were also telling us about how often they were victimized relationally, socially, experienced ethnic victimization and verbal victimization. And so this is just a combination of sort of all of those indicators of victimization. And we also had peers nominating children on how aggressive they are, so nominating how relationally, physically, and verbally aggressive their peers were. And what I just wanted to illustrate here is that these children were assessed 3 times over the course of one school term. So we were interested in thinking about how is it that aggression and victimization and internalizing problems are sort of cascading over a short period of time, as most of our research uses sort of 1-year follow-ups, and so we know that these peer relationships are much more dynamic than on a yearly assessment. And this is based on Courtney's honors thesis, and what we found is that children who were reporting high levels of internalizing symptoms at the beginning of the school term, so in January, by 2 months later, they were reporting that they were experiencing higher levels of peer victimization. And then by the end of the school term, they were reporting even higher levels of internalizing problems. So it suggests that there's really this sort of cascading influence among these constructs. We also see if we were to use more of a form of peer exclusion, so these might not necessarily be intentional, but children are just being excluded by their peer group, so kids don't want to play with them. We also see very similar findings that internalizing problems are increasing this risk for kids not wanting to play with another child, and also children who were nominated as being more aggressive. Thinking about peer victimization again sort of for a later sample. So this is a sample of children from grades 5 to grade 7, and they were followed up over the course of 1 year. And Wendy Craig and Deb Pepler were thinking about these they identified these 4 trajectories. And so we saw a very large group, this about 90% of children who never reported experiencing, or early adolescents who never reported experiencing any victimization. But there was this stable group of about 2% of children who experienced very high levels of victimization over time. And also, interesting, this sort of increasing group over the 1 year period. And so thinking about that group of high stable children, they were also reporting sort of the lowest levels of social competence. So they didn't have some of these sort of interpersonal skills, had a hard time sort of interacting well with others. And so that contributed to this risk of these high levels of peer victimization. They also generally reported sort of the lowest levels of trust and affection in their peer relationships. So they didn't have someone that they could rely on or a friend who they could talk to. And they also reported the highest levels of bullying behaviors. And we see for that group that was increasing over time, these were the children who were reporting very high levels of anxiety and symptoms of depression. So it was something about those internalizing symptoms that were increasing their risk for victimization. Now, turning to aggression, we see a whole host of risk factors as well for aggression that some are at the individual level here. So thinking about this emotional dysregulation, so these children who are aggressing against peers have a hard time sort of managing their feelings of anger and thinking about that it's okay to feel angry, but what you do with that anger might not be okay. These children also tend to show these high levels of these aggressive social cognitions. So they're more likely to interpret malicious intent on the part of another peer when something might just be really benign. So if a child, they're walking down the hallway and a child bumps into them, they're more likely to think that the child did it on purpose than it being sort of an accident. As I mentioned earlier, these children are also tend to be show higher levels of this moral disengagement. So thinking that it's perfectly okay to hit someone if they hit you first. Research also suggests that there's this sort of co-occurring risk for delinquency and conduct problems, so that delinquency might be sort of a later risk for children who have been engaging in this peer aggression. And for adolescents, we also see that adolescents who are engaging in more delinquent behavior also tend to report higher levels of peer aggression. And one of the last things I want to talk about is pro-social behaviors. So pro-social behaviors tend to be negatively correlated with particularly these direct forms of aggression, so physical and verbal aggression. But it's not necessarily negatively correlated with indirect aggression. And some studies suggest that children and youth who are using more of these indirect forms of aggression might be rated as high on pro-social behaviors. I would argue that the way that sometimes these pro-social behaviors are measured aren't necessarily capturing that inherent sense of pro-social behaviors as being really something that you do for somebody else, not thinking about using a nice behavior to get what you want. That's not necessarily pro-social. One of the other risks has been thinking about these peer popularity. And this interesting study from Toon Sillison and one of his students followed this sample of adolescents in the United States from grade 5 to grade 9. It was a sample of about 1,000 adolescents. And what they found is that across from that transition from grade 5 all the way up to grade 9, that youth who were engaging in more physical aggression, they became increasingly disliked over time. So there's really these sort of two indicators of popularity. One about popularity is about kids who are nice, they're helpful, everybody wants to play with them because they're nice. But there's this other group of children who are seen as popular. They might be leaders, but they're not necessarily liked. And so adolescents have known this for a long time, that there's some youth who are really highly visible within their peer group, but they aren't necessarily that nice. We did a more of a qualitative study with kindergarten to grade 3 children, and young children tell us this distinction as well. We asked them, what does it mean to be popular? And young children told us, well, it means that everybody wants to play with you, but you don't have to be that nice. So it was they're really sort of identifying these sort of distinctions on what it means to be popular very young. Getting back to this study, we see that relational aggression was also associated with this decrease of social preference over time. So they became increasingly disliked, but yet they had this corresponding increase in this popularity, so they become more sort of leaders within that group. So by enacting this relational aggression, it was contributing to that sort of popularity. And this study suggested that really this sort of popularity sort of preceded some of these aggressive behaviors. So it almost afforded youth that opportunity to use that aggression because they had this central status within their peer group. So we want to think about how can we change those perceptions of this sort of high popular or high status within the peer group so that it really is about more pro-social behaviors and not necessarily these aggressive behaviors. So thinking about more protective factors, as I mentioned earlier, there are these individual protective factors, so high social competence, so being able to interact well with others. One of the really strong indicators of social competence is pro-social behaviors. So these are really about engaging in these positive behaviors that are in the service of others, not necessarily thinking about yourself. At the peer, I'll come back to that in a minute, really thinking about high quality friendships. At the family level, we know that high levels of parental monitoring are negatively related, particularly to peer aggression. So this is when parents know their children's peers, they invite their peer group over for play dates. They actually ask adolescents what they're doing. So there really is this sort of dialogue that's ongoing between parents and adolescents. And we also know that high-quality parent-child relationships are negatively related to both victimization and aggression. And at the school level, there's also these high-quality relationships that children have with their teachers that make a difference. And I'll come back to that in a minute, as well as thinking about sort of these more supportive, inclusive school settings or classroom settings. So one of the one of the protective factors is at the sort of peer level is just having a best friend. So we know that research indicates that children who report just having one best friend experience less victimization, so they're less likely to be victimized. It's just about having someone they can rely on. And for children who do experience victimization but have a friend, we see that having that friend sort of buffers those negative outcomes of internalizing problems and also externalizing problems. So it's seen as a buffer. One, it protects from experiencing victimization, and then for adolescents who do experience it, it buffers them from adverse outcomes. There's also been some research in thinking about if we're in a sort of multicultural setting like we are here in Edmonton, what are sort of the benefits of these cross-ethnic friendships? And we know that many of our schools, there's sort of multiple ethnic and cultural groups within these settings. And this research suggests that for children in these, particularly in more ethnically diverse classrooms, that when they have these cross-ethnic friendships, that this is a particular protective factor. So it's not just having a friend, but it's having friends from other ethnic groups as well. And interestingly, we see that this is related to increases in children's pro-social behaviors. We want to think about how we can distinguish this sort of victimization and ensure that we're distinguishing it from conflicts that children have with their peers. So it's not necessarily this ongoing conflict, there's not this power differential, but really thinking about conflicts as a way or an opportunity for children to learn how to work through problems with others. And it might be really a safe place for children to learn how to resolve conflicts. So we know that teachers are really seen as a protective factor for children, particularly for children who are experiencing peer victimization. Teachers have been written about sort of this invisible hand that they enact in the classroom setting so that they can really direct sort of these positive peer relationships and model for children how to interact well with others. There's been really these two dimensions of teacher-child relationships that have been written about. One are these sort of positive relationships. So this is sort of warmth and closeness. So children feel that they can rely on their teacher. When they have a problem, they can talk to their teacher. There's also this what's considered more negative dimensions are conflict. So teachers and children who often have conflict with each other. So a teacher might tell us, you know, this is a child I often struggle with. We have a hard time sort of connecting. There's also a group of children that teachers sometimes tell us about that are overly dependent. So these children are seen as very clingy on them. And so teachers sometimes report that these are somewhat can interfere with the daily classroom setting or the daily interactions within the classroom. Some research suggests that when children are experiencing these high levels of conflict with their teachers, they're also concurrently experiencing high levels of victimization from the peer group. And so it might be seen as sort of this dual risk that some of these children are experiencing. So if they in some way aren't able to form that close relationship with teachers, it can put them sort of at double jeopardy. On the other hand, we know that children have this close relationship with teachers that it might protect them from being victimized. And for children who are victimized, that it serves as an additional protective factor over time. This is one study from children from pre-kindergarten to grade 1, and these are children who were highly socially, or levels of social withdrawal. So we see that the dotted lines are for children who were experiencing low levels of social withdrawal, the dashed lines are moderate levels, and the solid lines are high levels of social withdrawal. And on the top panel, these are children who are experiencing very low levels of conflict with their teachers. And so what we see is that these lines look very similar. So children who were socially withdrawn weren't experiencing more victimization when they had low levels of this conflict with their teachers. Unlike on the bottom panel, for children who were highly socially withdrawn, these are often seen as sort of targets for victimization. When they were also experiencing this high level of conflict with teachers, that they were experiencing sort of more victimization. I just want to show you this as a diagram. This is a sample that I told you about, and this is a paper that my graduate student is working on, is thinking about this, what's sometimes seen as this negative dimension of teacher-child relationships, this dependency, that children who are showing higher levels of depression and anxiety, that they might be seeking out these teachers, and so these teachers might really be seen as sort of a source of support for them. Now, thinking about school and classroom protective factors, we know that classrooms that are sort of more emotionally supportive and have these respectful interactions, that this is a buffer for children's experiences of victimization, and also a particular buffer for children who might be highly anxious within a classroom. So having a warm, nurturing, supportive classroom environment. So these are classrooms where everybody knows each other's names, they say, you know, please and thank you, there's a lot of smiles, laughter, you really get this sense of relational connections. This is also at the school level. So when children and adolescents tell us that they feel that there's more people within their school that they can talk to if they have a problem, it could be adults, it could be teachers, that these children within these school settings also are reporting less victimization. And I'll turn to the last 2 points here with a couple of slides, and thinking about these norms within a classroom. So the norms within a classroom, these are really about sort of that acceptability of aggression. So we ask children, we say, how much do you think that other classmates would say, it's okay if I hit another child who hit me first? Or how much is it okay that I yell back at somebody who yelled at me first? And what we see is that children who report higher levels of these sort of norms that support aggression within their classroom, they show these heightened levels of victimization over time. So this is the same sample that I was telling you about, except for now they're followed over the course of 18 months, so the 18 months on the x-axis. And so they were followed over from a January of one school term to June of the second school term. And these were sort of 4 trajectories of victimization that we identified. So relative to our low stable group, which is about 60% of children at the bottom, this group of children that were showing these sort of high stable levels in the green bar, and also these initial high levels in the black line that decreased over time, these children told us that their classroom, they were more supportive of aggressive behavior. So there was something about the acceptability of aggression. Now thinking about the group in the red line, so these are the children that reported sort of stable, elevated levels of victimization over time. These children were in classrooms that were rated as being less emotionally supportive relative to the children that were in the classrooms in that blue line. So there's something about when there's not necessarily this level of support within the classroom that can contribute to the stability of victimization. This is the same sample looking at children's reports of physical aggression. So we have these 2 trajectories. And the children that were on this high trajectory in the red line, these were also children who were in a classroom that reported sort of these higher levels of acceptability of aggression. So it suggests that there's something about that sort of classroom dynamic among all the children and the classmates. This is work that's been done by Phil Rodkin and thinking about this hierarchy. So I told you about the sort of social status that children are afforded, and particularly might be for more aggressive children. So what their research suggests is that in classroom where there's this greater hierarchy, so there's really this sort of divide between kids who are seen as the leaders and kids who are seen as sort of the followers, that within these classrooms there was a greater acceptability of aggression. So aggression on the bottom x-axis here at high levels of aggression. These kids were seen as more popular when they were in a classroom that had more of this hierarchy. So there was sort of less of this equal relationships among children. Very similarly, we see that children who were more aggressive, when they were in a classroom that had this high degree of hierarchy, that they were seen as more well-liked. So it's okay to be aggressive in these classrooms if you're sort of at that top end of that spectrum. Okay. So thinking about all these risk and protective factors, I want to turn now to thinking about prevention and what programs have been thinking about for both bullying and victimization prevention. So we know that there's hundreds of bullying and violence prevention programs that are marketed to schools. If you're interested, you can look on the Ontario Ministry of Education. They list a whole host of programs. The problem is that many of these programs haven't been evaluated. We don't know if they work. They might actually be contributing to more problems than reducing them. So we want to think about sort of what are sort of evidence-based strategies and programs. Some research suggests that the programs that schools are using, only about 8% of them have been evidence-based, showing really sort of effects in the direction that we would expect in terms of reducing bullying or peer aggression. And most of the programs that schools are using are really these one-time initiatives. So these aren't sustained strategies. There's often sort of a fragmented approach to thinking about ways that we can prevent bullying and victimization. And so we want to think about what are sort of more comprehensive strategies that we can use. Here's a sort of an idea of some of the things that have come out of bullying prevention programs that suggest that they are more effective. So ones that really use this whole school approach. So it's involving everybody within the school. So it's not targeted with that specific children, and it's not targeted within specific classrooms. Also, if they consist of some combination of these multiple components. So they might have these sort of school and class-wide rules and sort of sanctions. There might be some teacher training and skill support for teachers. There's some sort of classroom curriculum that teachers are helping children learn about these sort of social emotional learning skills, and they're also addressing children's beliefs and attitudes, so the beliefs about the acceptance of bullying. They often typically target some sort of social problem-solving training, so this is giving children role plays and opportunities to enact the new set of skills that they're learning. Really, by children enacting these skills, they have that opportunity to practice them ahead of time. And they also typically include some sort of individual child support. So these are for children who are really chronically victimized, or children who are chronically aggressive, really thinking that they might need a little bit of additional support in addition to this universal approach. And really programs that involve all students. I told you about the bystanders, so we want to think about all the students and also the teachers, so, and not just the teachers, but all the school staff. There's been essentially about 4 programs that have shown some benefits for children in thinking about bullying prevention. The first one is this Ulvaeus prevention program that was implemented in Norway, and this was really sort of the beginning focus of prevention work. And so the focus here is really about sort of developing these school rules. There's no curriculum that schools use. It's really about having the school come together to come up with these school rules and strategies. And it's really focusing on about increasing teacher awareness and these sort of cooperative learning strategies across the program. This really follows this train-the-trainer model. And there's an individual or a school level component, classroom level component. So schools or classrooms sort of come up with their own rules within that classroom and expectations. And then there's also this individual component I told you about supporting the children. This program's showing some benefits, particularly in Norway, except for when it's been implemented in the US and Canada, we see less consistent effects. So it suggests that there might be something about context that's really important and about cultural diversity. But this was really one of the first programs to get us thinking about bullying prevention programs. The KiVa program is a more recent program. This is in Finland. And interestingly enough, Finland has, across the country, all schools are mandated to have a bullying prevention program. And most schools now are using this KiVa program. So this builds from the Ulvaeus idea of thinking about these school rules, but it also has this inherent focus on these sort of bystanders and increasing empathy for children who are victimized, and also improving children's strategies to intervene. This has been developmentally appropriate, but it's developed for children across grades 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and 7 to 9. And again, it has these sort of multi-level components while also giving 10 2-hour lessons for children. So it has some sort of curriculum component for it. Some of the initial findings from the grade 4 to grade 6 sample have been promising. There's been longer term evaluations, so the results I present down here are really over sort of a 1-year follow-up, but there's been just more recently some longer term follow-ups have been coming out. But this really shows some promise and gets us in a little more of a line of thinking about these social emotional learning programs. The Steps to Respect program is been implemented. It was developed through the Committee for Citizens in Seattle, and has been implemented in the U.S. And there's currently a larger evaluation of this program. This again focuses on these sort of school-wide focus on this sort of staff awareness and responsiveness. And then it's also thinking about how we can support children's socially responsive beliefs and their social emotional skills. And again, there's teachers have an orientation, and then there's about 10 one-hour lessons. So it's thinking a little bit more about how we can integrate them, these lessons into children's daily routines within the schools. But the difficulty with most of these programs is that they are sort of in addition to what teachers are already doing. So it's hard sometimes to implement these. The WITS program that I've been involved with, and that's now being implemented throughout BC. There's a host of schools in Ontario and some schools in Alberta that are using this program. This is sort of taking the idea of those bullying prevention programs, but really thinking about how can we involve the community. So the WITS program started from a principal, but it also works in collaboration with the Rock Solid Foundation, which is a police group, and really bringing these sort of messages back into the community. So we have within this program the police group and also university school athletes, other EMS professionals are visiting children's classrooms and schools on a regular basis and reminding them about how we can use their WITS. So the idea behind WITS is walk away, ignore, talk it out, and seek help. And it's really about giving very young children in sort of kindergarten to grade 3 these sort of strategies that they could use to deal with peer bullying. And also thinking about how can we get staff on, or school staff on board and other adults like parents to help support children and listen to them when they're telling us about these instances. And there's been some promising findings from the WITS program. I'll just leave the website there if you're interested. All the resources for the WITS program are available online, and it can be implemented at any point in time by teachers. I'd like to just move for the last bit here and thinking about social emotional learning programs. And this is really where I think that these sort of bullying prevention programs need to move to. Unfortunately, most of the bullying programs I told you about, only about 8% of them are evidence-based. But of those evidence-based programs, they show very small effect size. So they're not really having a big impact. And I think that the difficulty with these is because they're often focused on sort of thinking about the aggressor without thinking about all those other skills that we need to support children. And they're not necessarily thinking about the adults, aside from some of these bullying ones I just told you about, but really thinking about that adults is one of the key ways that we can best support children. So Mark Greenberg has written about that these social emotional learning programs, these are really a comprehensive mission for schools to educate students to really thinking about helping them become sort of knowledgeable, responsible, socially skilled, healthy, caring, and contributing citizens. So it's not just about these aggressive behaviors, but thinking about this broader set of skills that children have. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the PASS program and the PEERS program. So first of all, the social emotional learning is really seen to be these sort of 5 core competencies that the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL in the US has written about. And there's really been this push to thinking about social emotional learning programs within a school setting. CASEL's identified these sort of 5 interrelated sets of cognitive, affective, behavioral competencies for children. So we have self-awareness. So this is about the ability to recognize your own emotions and your own thoughts and how those might influence behavior. Thinking about self-management, this is really more in terms of what we often talk about as self-regulation. So how children can sort of regulate those emotions, down-regulate themselves and also up-regulate themselves. How they can manage their behaviors in a given setting, and also how they can manage their attention. So are they able to pay attention, or are they continually distracted? And so these are really about these sort of skills that children need to sort of support their learning within a school setting. There's also the social awareness is really about taking perspectives of others. So can you sort of attend to that another child might have a different perspective of that conflict than what you did? And really thinking about sort of this empathy. So how can we promote empathy for young children? The very bottom one is thinking about relationship skills. So this is about how we can establish and maintain these positive relationships across with our peers, with our teachers, other adults, our parents. So really thinking about these positive relationship skills. And then the last one is responsible decision making. So thinking about how is it that we can make appropriate decisions in a given context. And we know particularly that adolescents have a hard time when something's very emotionally evocative, there's a lot of peers around, they might be more likely to engage in risky behaviors. So these social emotional competencies are really about ways that we can help support them thinking about these skills. Stephanie Jones, who I've worked with and is at Harvard now, and Suzanne Bouffard have written this nice social policy report. So if you're interested, through the Society for Research on Child Development, on their website, they have their publications. And through their publications, they have these social policy reports. So these are about getting some of this message, outside of the academic setting. And they've written about sort of the social emotional learning framework for schools. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple components of this framework. So over on the left-hand side, we have the school and classroom context. We could add community in there. And thinking about how is it that we can support these healthy relationships? What does it mean to have a healthy community or a healthy school or a healthy classroom setting? How well are, within a classroom setting, how well are teachers able to sort of manage misbehaviors within that classroom? And then if we're using these social emotional learning strategies, how well are we able to implement those? These are directly related to teachers' own skills at the very top. So thinking about that we don't need to just focus on children, but we also need to focus on the adults in children's lives, and about helping adults sort of regulate their own social and emotional well-being. And that these are directly related to this sort of core set of children's social emotional learning competencies. And by promoting these social emotional learning competencies in the center of this box, that we will also have these short-term and long-term outcomes. These ideal long-term outcomes is really mental health and sort of relationship health. Many of these social emotional learning programs really focus on pro-social behaviors and promoting pro-social behaviors. These are really seen as sort of the foundational skill for healthy relationships with others. And we know that young children are very good at doing these things. They're keen to help others, and they want to cooperate well with others. So it's thinking about, with social emotional learning programs, how can we build on that set of skills that children have? The PASS program that has been implemented for the last 20 to 30 years across in the U.S. Schools in Calgary have been using the PASS program for the last 13 years. And this is really one of the sort of early social emotional learning programs. There's a preschool version and also a K-5 program. And these are lessons that are designed to be taught about 3 times per week for about 20 to 30 minutes. These are in addition, though, to what teachers are necessarily doing within the classroom. There's, for grades kindergarten to 5, there's 3 main areas of the units. So some of these focus on the sort of school readiness skills and children's self-control. The next component focuses on these relationships and children's feelings. So it's about helping children identify their feelings. If children can't label what they're feeling, it's very hard for them to sort of think about strategies to regulate those feelings. And then the last component is focused on these sort of interpersonal problem-solving skills. This program has shown substantial impacts, much stronger than anti-bullying programs. And indeed, other programs that are more focused on sort of social emotional learning show stronger effect size or higher effect sizes than do many of these bullying prevention programs. And I think that's because they really focus more broadly on the child and really focus on the sort of whole child. So I'll tell you just briefly about the PEERS program that we were working at in our lab, thinking about that I was somewhat frustrated with these anti-bullying programs and the focus only on aggressive children instead of thinking about how we can support all children. So the PEERS program was, the development of this and the initial pilot evaluation was supported by the center. And so this is an social emotional learning program that's really a kindergarten to grade 4 classroom. The set of lessons we have, you could use them as a kindergarten to grade 3, or you could use them as a grade 1 to grade 4, depending on sort of the makeup of your school. So we know some children are coming into kindergarten a little bit less prepared than they are in other settings. So it's really meant to be a little bit more flexible. There's sort of group and dyadic level activities. So the idea is that we want children to be working with sort of all the children within their classroom. And so they're not consistently sitting with one child, but really need to interact well with others. And because we know that in interacting well with other children, we're breaking down some of those stereotypes that children might have. And they're learning a new set of skills of working with children across diverse activities. And there's also a teacher component. So the 3 main areas sort of the PEERS focus is thinking about these instructional practices for the classroom. So really this emotional support and these organizations. So how can we support teachers in doing what they need to be doing in terms of their lessons so that they're not continually managing misbehaviors. There's a focus on children's social and interpersonal skills, and also a focus on their own emotional awareness and regulation. One unique piece of this program is that there's a mental health component, and this really is tied to this professional development with teachers. So thinking about how can we best support teachers. So we had counseling graduate students who would visit the classrooms on a bi-weekly basis, and thinking about identifying children maybe that teachers were having a harder time with, or thinking about children who are maybe having a difficult time interacting with their peers. And so it was about sitting down with the teachers and coming up with some strategies, collaborative strategies together to think about what might work most for some of those children. There's also these multi-roundtable sessions, and this is about bringing all the teachers within a class or within a school, and not just the teachers, but also the aides together to focus on sort of specific topics that teachers had identified that they want to learn a little bit more about, and maybe things that they were having a hard time with in their classrooms. So it was really an opportunity for teachers to sit down together, guided by some of our counseling students. The peers curriculum is also a classroom-based piece that teachers are delivering, and so there's 6 units with about 3 to 4 lessons per unit that are really covered across the school year. And the idea here is that these are really sort of developmentally appropriate, so they, there's a set of books that target children at each different sort of developmental age. And the idea here is that we don't want to have something add-on that teachers are doing outside of what they're learning. The focus on sort of social emotional learning is really how can we integrate these into sort of those daily routines and practices within a setting, and so that it's not seen as, oh, now we have to have our 5 minutes of our peers program, but really how we can integrate this into what teachers are doing. And teachers were often using this within the health and life skills curriculum, so using this instead of the other health and life skills curriculum, or integrating into the language arts. Some teachers were integrating into social studies. So the main parts of the curriculum, I won't go through so much, but the beginning we focus on the moral code, things that teachers are already doing. So how can you build sort of these classroom rules that all the children come together to reflect what was going to be important for them to help them learn and interact well with each other over the school term. And then the next 2 components are really thinking about helping children sort of identify feelings and what you can do with some of those feelings. So it's okay to feel angry, but what you do with it might differ. And then the last 3 units are focused a little bit more on these sort of relationships with others. So children need this foundation of these emotional skills before they can form these sort of positive relationships with others. And this gets closer to what we consider sort of more of these sort of bullying prevention programs. So helping children resolve conflicts with others, and thinking about how can you build friendships and sustain those friendships over time. So I want to turn now to the very last part of the talk and thinking about some recommendations driven from this research. So we know that evidence-based programs and strategies really need to target not just individual level characteristics, but really thinking about at the broader setting level features, so thinking about classrooms. And we really need to focus on how we can develop these in combination and implement them successfully. We need to think about ways that we can sort of scale up programs and strategies that have been developed at a local level. Typically, we're using these sort of fragmented strategies across schools. Even within a school, teachers are using different things. Within a community, we're using very different strategies. So what would be some sort of common, essential ingredients that we really need to use to think about ways to best support children? And by coming up with some sort of coordination of this programming and evidence-based strategies and policies across a range of community stakeholders. So it's not just about schools, but it's also about involving parents and involving community members and key community groups. This might be more easily achieved sometimes in smaller rural communities, but really thinking about who are those sort of key people that we need to bring to the table. And we want to know about these programs, how we can sort of effectively adapt, establish programs and tailor them to local community needs. So there are some good programs out there, but we need to know, do they work within our local settings and with our local populations? So we really want to support these sort of developmentally appropriate programs or strategies and thinking about children's, developmental needs. And we want to think about how we can support programs and strategies that really focus on building these healthy peer relationships. So instead of focusing on the negative all the time and thinking about aggression and bullying, what are these sort of key set of skills and competencies that children already bring to the table, and how can we enhance those in children? Some of the social emotional learning programs, I believe, show some promise in doing this, that they can really reinforce these sort of key social emotional learning skills that children have. And then last, some of these social universal programs, and I'm not just focused on programs, but they're also sort of these integrated strategies that schools are using. So I'm not selling that we need to mostly have a program, but it's really about a set of integrated strategies that everybody within a given setting is using so that children have this sort of common language to know what we're talking about. And so when they talk to a peer about a way to resolve a conflict, that the other child might be on board, that they have some sort of common language across them. And we know with some of these programs that some of the key things are that they're targeting multiple skills, so not just focused on one behavior, that they integrate sort of this teaching and reinforcement. So thinking about how we can sort of capture those teachable moments in children and integrate those skills. And that's really been one of the key focus of the WITS program that I told you about, is really focused on sort of these teachable moments that arise throughout a given day for young children, how we can incorporate those. Some programs that have a selected component as well have been seen as being more effective. And so a selected component is when we have those sort of individualized, tailored approaches for particular children who might be highly aggressive or more vulnerable to victimization, so they might be highly anxious. And we want to, of course, involve parents and community groups. And lastly, we need some sort of rigorous evidence and long-term evidence about the effectiveness of these strategies and how well they're implemented. So when we implement a program in a school setting, we're hoping that it can be implemented by folks within the community, whether that's the teachers or local community personnel, so that it's not always professionals necessarily that are sort of transplanted into a school setting, but really how can we work with communities to build those skills. So in conclusion, overall, the whole talk, I think what we talked about is a little bit of these forms of relational and cyber forms of aggression and victimization, that these tend to increase across childhood while physical forms tend to decrease. And I want to remind you that there's substantial heterogeneity in these forms of aggression and victimization, and we really want to think about sort of children across these different trajectories that I was showing you, and what would be most supportive of all these children. And because peer aggression and victimization tend to co-occur with diverse forms of maladjustment, and I talked to you mostly about internalizing, externalizing problems. And that some of these programs show promise, but particularly when we're involving adults. And so getting adults on board and thinking about what are some opportunities, learning opportunities we can provide for adults. I listed teachers here because typically these have been implemented in schools, but we can think a bit more broadly about that. And we want to integrate these into a daily setting. So what will be posted, what Amy will post on the website, are some resources I've listed. So PrevNet is a Canadian network of community groups and also researchers across Canada that are really thinking about how can we support healthy relationships and sort of prevent violence. The Society for Safe and Caring Schools, which is located here in Edmonton. The CASTLE website is a large resource for thinking about what are some effective strategies. The Public Health Agency of Canada's their best practices portal. So this lists programs that have shown, demonstrated some effectiveness. So you have sort of a key of what would be some key programs that might work within a given community, or some key strategies. And then also, of course, the Government of Alberta Human Services that we heard a little bit about, and the resources that are available on their website. Thinking about programs, there's the WITS program that I told you about. The Peers program is currently available through my website, or if you contact me, I can share some more information about that. The PASS program is also available. This is a program that you do need to purchase at schools, so it can be expensive for schools. The 4th R is a program that's come out of the University of Western Ontario. David Wolf has really led this charge. This is focused more on adolescence. So most of these programs target sort of early childhood and are across sort of the elementary school years. And we don't want to forget about adolescence. This is really key, and we want to think about our programs, how they can be effective across these sort of critical transition periods for children, adolescents. And the 4th R program has shown some really promising effects in supporting healthy relationships. And then also the PACS Good Behavior Game. This is, we're currently doing evaluation of the PACS Good Behavior Game here in Alberta, working with Dr. Dennis Embry and Dr. Ron Prince, and thinking about where schools that are using this PACS Good Behavior game, the idea is about supporting teachers and having these sort of healthy classrooms and how they can sort of help children self-regulate. And we're also combining this with the Triple P parenting program that's implemented through all our parent link centers, and thinking about if we have this combination of programs that target at the school and also are targeting families and parents, will we see stronger impacts for children's healthy development? And then some video resources. Tomorrow night, there will be the Angry Kids Stressed Out Parents on the Doc Zone. Interviewed on as part of this video is Dr. Mark Greenberg, who I talked about from the past program, is also Dr. Robert McMahon, who's right now at SFU, and he's leading their new Institute on Violence Prevention at Simon Fraser University, and also Dr. Dennis Embry, who's the with the Paxis Institute, which sort of runs the PACS Good Behavior game and is leading the evaluation of the PACS program here in Alberta. It's a Girl's World is an older video that really showcases sort of this relational aggression among sort of pre-adolescent girls, and it gives you sort of a good flavor into these experiences that these young girls were having. And a couple years ago there was a documentary through CBS called Words Can Kill that really sort of gives us an idea of this devastating effects that cyber aggression and cyber victimization can have. So thank you very much for your attention and for listening, and I want to recognize the support of ACCFCR in bringing me here. So thank you very much for your attention.
So Wendy, I already have a couple of questions from the webcast audience, and just people in the room, if you do have a question, just let me know and I'll come over with the microphone. Are there any supports that parents can use to support their children's development?
Are there any
supports? Programs, supports?
So through, for instance, here in Alberta, the Parent Link Centers are implementing the Triple P parenting program. I know some other centers are also using the Incredible Years program, which really has this parent focus. And so there are some programs. It's just finding out what your community might be specifically using.
My second question from the OCYA is how can these strategies be used in specialized classrooms or schools where many of the young people have serious behavioral or mental health challenges like oppositional defiance disorder or ODD?
Right, so thinking about some of these strategies, these are really sort of these key foundational skills. So the idea behind many of these programs is that they're somewhat flexible to the context. Not that Mark Greenberg, I don't think, would want the past program adapted extensively, but they're really about building this sort of key set of skills, working with children from sort of diverse backgrounds. And so through some of these strategies, it might be more sort of smaller steps with these children. And so it might be using something that's developmentally tailored to them, but going through these strategies at sort of a different rate for some of these young children. And again, most of these programs really focus on this sort of healthy relationship. So it's about building that relationship first and foremost through the important adults in those children's lives and with that child.
And a comment from Brian is that he's glad to see that emotional self-awareness is finally becoming part of the curriculum, and he believes that it should be one of the core components of education.
It should be one of the core components of education. We focus on sort of the academic learning, and really the drive behind the social emotional learning is really putting the social emotional piece as up front as our academic learning, and thinking about that these are really key skills that children need to be able to learn well within their school setting.
And I just personally wanted to add a comment about the Doc Zone show that's going to be on tomorrow night at 9 p.m. on CBC television, is that it will be featuring, it's called Angry Kids and Stressed Out Parents, and it will be featuring two programs that you mentioned, PACS and Triple P, that are actually funded through health and available. Triple P is available at every Parent Link Center at no charge for parents across the province.